That may be the smoothest bobbin change I've ever done. This is a trouser toiling video, similar to what you might call a muslin, defining them as the pattern cut from a cheaper cloth in order to check that the pattern you make, in this case, that in case there need to be any major changes, that the pattern that couldn't be made if it was cut in the final cloth already. That, as well as less major changes that just further improve the fit, and doing that as efficiently and quickly and cheaply as possible. As far as looks go, one time a tailor more experienced than me and many said, "I've never had a customer complain about how a fitting looks." Another tailor, more experienced than me as well, has said that this is the first time a customer is seeing their garment, so they make it look as neat as possible. You can pick which philosophy you agree with more. As always, I'm using my Cilicia. It works out £6 a metre, and after I cut it apart and reuse it, I can use the Cilicia to make pockets and other such things afterwards. Other varied details regarding what and why, I'll cover them as I'm making it. As far as efficiency goes, a cursory look at the footage I took, which includes a few blunders and leaving the camera on running for some reason at one point, it took less than an hour in total. About 25 minutes total machining, and that's on my domestic, which is generally an awful lot slower than most machines, although that was using a wide stitch. About 20 minutes doing prep things, which usually is practically cut out for me when I make it anyway, and plus 10 minutes to strike and cut and 20 minutes to finish and press at the end. If they were being made with other features like pleats and brace backs, these are just flat fronted, then basically the same principles apply. This is not something that I've been shown or told how to do. I've practically made it up based on how I've been taught to make trousers and what I know needs to happen in order to make sure the fit is accurately checked. In this case, they're being taken away for the person to try them on, since the train ticket would cost more than the trousers would in the end. On top of that, that's something useful for a toile, because it's cheap, it's quick, it can be taken away for you to never see it again, and, well, either pictures or a video from the person trying it on, and you could alter the pattern from there. Since this is my Cilicia, I cut out only what I need for each garment I make, which is why there's a huge chunk missing instead of just being a straight edge, as you would almost always find on a roll of Cilicia in a cutting room. The pattern should be placed onto the cloth in simply the most economical way possible. How it works in typical bespoke cutting is that there would be extra cloth left in order to alter and generally be able to make the trouser. The front trouser, or top side for the initiated, doesn't need any for the toile. I also don't pay attention to putting it on the grain of the cloth. It's a toile, it doesn't need that much thought, especially cut from this cotton. Just placing it as economically as possible. The dart on the waistline, the fork notch, and the knee points all need to be added correctly to properly make up the pattern and accurately check that it works and how it fits. With the back trouser, or underside, same thing. I'm not paying much attention to putting it on the grain, just making sure it's leaving as much useful bits of cloth around it as possible. The underside usually has a lot more cloth added to each seam than the top side, but in this case, only one edge needs a little bit of extra. Any inlay added to other seams would just slow down the process of making a toile. The dart or darts and the knee balance marks need to be chalked. The only inlay or extra cloth that the toile needs is on the seat seam. On bespoke trouser patterns, the underside seat seam shouldn't have a seam allowance, because it's nearly the most imperative seam to sew correctly. Therefore, the seam allowance needs to be added on the cloth, generally referred to as inlay. It can be a rough seam allowance just to cut along. If the inseams match properly, then the seat seam that was chalked straight from the pattern will be what is machined, disregarding the raw edge that will be cut. In the event the cloth is narrow or there isn't quite enough left for the fork, the trouser can be pushed off of the cloth and a fork piece can be added based on the same principle as adding a fork piece to a normal trouser. Cutting out the two pieces only taking into account everything I've already brought up. There will always be some scrap, but a lot of this I can keep and make use of in one way or another. I need to keep a piece of cloth aside though in order to make the fly. In order to make the toile more easily and to avoid mark stitching, I'm snipping into the knee balance points, which I'm sure is not a new idea for most people. Similarly, I'm just using a ruler and chalk to copy the dart onto the wrong side of the trouser pieces underneath. In Bespoke there is the normal waistband canvas, and I don't put Cilicia onto the waistband, I just use it as it is. I also have a waistband pattern, which is uncommon in my realm, but again I expect this is normal for most people. I just take enough waistband and cut it the size of the final waistband. I make it to the final waistband because this way I can remove it from the toile when I'm done and use it for the final trouser. The same reason I don't put a cloth cover on it, except that also takes more time and is just unnecessary. Lastly, to prepare I need to cut the flies. I do this without fly patterns, which is the same way that I make them when making a normal trouser. At most I'd have a template. I'll gloss through this because it's so similar, but I take a piece of the cotton that is, importantly, doubled up and placed under the top side. It's important that the leg is this way up, in essence with the left hand side leg underneath facing up and the right hand side leg on top facing the table. Doing it this way makes it easy to make a men's fly and have all of the pieces, the right side of the cloth, facing in the correct directions. The cotton needs to be below the notch a few centimeters and sticking out from the waistline and fly. I use the trouser as a guide to cut the piece of cotton underneath along the same lines as the waistband and fly, importantly copying the fork notch as well, snipping through all 4 layers of cloth. Removing the trouser, mark a horizontal line an arbitrary amount below the notch, at least 2 centimeters or 3/4 of an inch. Then mark about 5 centimeters or 2 inches from the fly line all the way up to shape the fly. From that line, mark at least another 5 centimeters or another 2 inches just near the top of the fly. Then find about 10 centimeters or 4 inches below the top edge, which was copied from the waistline. Curve it into the original line to create the shape of the bearer. Cut both layers of cotton around the shape of the bearer. Then cut through only the top layer along the original vertical line to give it the shape of the fly. This gives us the fly and the bearer. Mark the wrong sides on both pieces, which are still on the outside, and then they can be sewn onto the trouser easily because the right sides will only go one way on. In the toile, right side and wrong sides, it doesn't really matter, but it helps to make the trousers sewn together easily and correctly. I still have curved trouser zips, but any kind of zip will do. Usually in Bespoke, they're overlong and then cut down to size. I separate the top sides, exposing both right sides here. The zip goes onto the right hand trouser, so I'm placing it against the fly. I want to chalk the fork notch so that I can see it better, and mark about 1/2 centimeter or 1/4 of an inch from the edge of the fly, because I will line this up to the edge of the zip in order to make the fly. This is just the method I use these days, and usually I'd have the overlocking to tell me where to put the zip. I also do a chalk mark at the bottom of the zip tape below the bottom stop to tell me where I want to line it up to the fork notch. I pin it there to hold it and the bearer onto the side of the trouser that I need to sew it onto. The fly just gets placed against the edge of the fly seam and the notches get lined up to the trouser. For the darts, I don't need to iron them over. Since it's cotton, it can be finger pressed, and that will be enough to sew them well enough, which saves getting out the iron. They're drawn onto the sides that they need to be sewn along, so I just need to make sure they are folded perfectly in half so that the darts are the correct size. If I were doing this normally, I'd have the waistband cut and marked to size already, and then I'd go to the machine and do every machine stitch you see in this guide in one sitting. Separating it just makes it more clear exactly what order everything is being done in. This time, though, I'm sewing on the flies, sewing the darts and the outside leg seam in just this one go. I don't spend too much time agonizing over the darts, I just sew them and make sure they're the correct width to make sure the pattern is properly tested. I make the stitch length a bit wider than is normal just because it means it'll be faster and the stitches can easily be taken out to recycle the cotton and hardware. Placing the zip tape up to the edge I chalked, which would normally be the overlocking, not backtacking at the bottom or the top, stopping the stitch at the top of the trouser. I can easily take the bearer and place it right side to right side on the trouser, lining up the raw edges at the fork notch. This time backtacking, essentially this method is based on the width of the presser foot, so I want the edge of the presser foot to butt up against the zip teeth, which are now behind the topside cloth, making a small backtack onto the notch so that the bearer can't tear while I'm making it. So with the raw edges lined up, I'm using the zip teeth that we can't see to guide the fly under the machine, not backtacking at the top and only finishing at the top of the cotton. To sew the fly, raw edges and notches lined up, and it's sewn with a seam allowance smaller than a centimeter or 3/8 of an inch. This allows the seam to sit inside the edge in order to not be seen. It doesn't matter with the toile, but making it the same way every time makes it easier. Since there's no inlay, then I can backtack much more easily 1 centimeter or 3/8 below the top of the waistline. I basically approximate it, but if it's a little more, then it doesn't really matter. Making up all of the other darts as well. I don't see the point in taking much time to make the toile look nice, just to make the pattern up accurately. It's a waste of time and resources to overlock, bind, or bag anything, especially and perhaps specifically in my situation at least. This is bespoke, and the idea is to fit well. This isn't art, it's craft. Crushing originality can come later. Mark Rylance, The Outfit 2022. Though obviously this is only here to share my way of doing things, so you can take what techniques and ideas as you see fit. I realise at this point that I perhaps should have gone back to the board before this one, but it's fine. I sew the side seam, starting with lining up the knee balance marks. I know my pattern has the outleg seam the same length on the top side and the underside, but in some cases the underside is longer, and that means the seam needs to be eased in, which can be difficult enough, let alone with cotton. That's not how I draft patterns though. From the knee, I work up the seams to the waistline and sew it together from there with a seam allowance. Since there's no inlay, the seam can be sewn with either side up and from either the hem or the waistline. Might be worth saying here that make sure you're sewing the right sides together, otherwise it'll be half inside out. Plus a cut because my machine started glitching and the seam came out weird, but then sewing the other side of the outside leg seam just as easily as the first. I don't bother pressing the seam open at all, just because I don't care to get the iron out, and it saves me leaving the machine normally. Here I need to get the waistband ready. I have the pieces cut to size now, and in some ways I could work with that, just machine it onto the trouser as it is with leftover on either side. As it is though, I want to mark the center front, center back and side seam onto the tape of each piece. This is where different colors of pen can be helpful in the event the waist needs to be let out or taken in. I can make future marks in different colors. Since the band roll has a right side and a wrong side, there will be a left and right waistband. I basically just put the 3 marks on each and mark which is the front and back as well as the left and right side, which is easier when you already understand how the band roll works. I pin the waistband onto the trouser at the notches, placing the bias tape against the raw edge. It's better to line up the marks to the center front and back. If the trouser itself is bigger, then it should be eased into the waistband, and if it's too small, then the darts might be too big. Or the measures or the pattern might be incorrect. It's something that you'd have to go back and check. On the fly side, the left leg, I mark 1 centimeter or 3/8 of an inch from the raw edge of the trouser to place the center front mark from the band roll onto the trouser properly. Afterwards, I am immediately going to sew the inseam of the waistband, so I place the legs right side to right side again, putting the knee points together and working up the seams to check that they will line up. Normally I'm confident enough that it will if I made the pattern, so I don't check, but I do here just to illustrate. I start with the fly side here, which is only different because I back tack onto the center front mark, which is 1 centimeter or 3/8 from the edge of the fly. The fly itself also needs to be moved out of the way so that it is not sewed down in this stitch. It is basically the same method I use when making the fly in normal trousers, so it simplifies things just because there are less differences. As always with the band roll, the stitch is sewn just against the canvas itself through the bias tape along its edge. The bias tape underneath the band roll so that the seam can be pressed properly later on, which I won't necessarily do anyway. I don't stitch much or at all past the raw edge of the seat or back tack here at all. Similar for the other side where I start at the seat edge. At the fly, when there's a zip, I always stop and use the wheel to go over the zip, and everybody should too. I once found a trouser that somebody had thrown away. I wanted to take the zip off of it, but they'd not been careful and there was a large needle dent in one of the teeth, making it nearly useless. Here, if I'd kept the pedal to the plastic, I would have done the same. Sewing to the end of the bearer. Again, the inleg, it's easy. It can be sewn from the fork or the hem both times, starting with lining up each knee point. It's generally important that neither seam is stretched or shrunk, so I think it might take some practice to do this well, or it can be basted or pinned while laying gently flat. Next is the seat seam. What I do when making up the trouser is chalk on the rest of the seam between the inleg seam, where there would normally be extra cloth so it's more hidden, and on the top side from the fork and onto the band roll. If the trouser was cut this specific way, the original chalk mark from cutting will be on the left trouser with the fly, not the zip and the bearer. This makes it easier because I didn't have to mark stitch or draw the seam onto the opposite underside. At the fly, I mark the fork notch and chalk 1 seam allowance from the edge down the fly. This is easy on cotton and why I like to add the cotton crotch piece on finished trousers. The chalk lines should easily join across the seam allowances on the inleg seam. At the top of the seat seam at the waistband, the stitch has to go on the band roll in a vertical line. So I draw the right angle onto the band roll where the center back is marked, which is also where it lines up to the seat seam on the trouser itself. This is more like how I will make a trouser. With both trouser legs right side out, I place the fork notches at the base of the fly together, lining up the raw edges. It is very important that the fork notches are level because the waistband at the center front also needs to line up to finish the fly enclosure properly. I put pins in just for show. I'll often do this freehand when there isn't a camera in the way. Following the seam all along, the inleg seams don't necessarily have to match, but usually better ones do because of how the dress was cut out. But I didn't do that here. Therefore, they should match. Placing the raw edges of the underside together, making sure the waistband at the back also matches. Working back down from the center back at the waistband, and if there's any excess cloth, that should be eased in around the curve of the seat, because that portion is highly on the bias, making it easier. Less so with cotton, but with wool it should easily disappear. Placing the trouser under the machine, I first want to stitch towards the fork notch. I place it so that I'm stitching along the chalk line that I drew instead of relying on finding the seam allowance. I stitch up towards the notch, keeping the zip, bearer and fly all out of the way of the stitch that I'm making, only sewing through the trouser legs. At the fork notch, turning around to sew back along that stitching and then following the chalk mark still. Back tack at the top of the waistband canvas to finish the stitch. There is no use in sewing the seat seam again like would be normal. And to save a baste by hand, I open the seam of the waistband canvas to sew down all of the inlay. This just stops it from flapping around. I checked the stitch around the fly and I came up about a stitch or two short of the notch, but that won't make any difference here, and the fly in the waistband is even, so that's the important thing. Normally I'd then just sit here with a few pins and a piece of chalk to sew the zip in place. I'll show two perspectives in this, one that hopefully better shows what it is that I do, and another that shows more how I normally do it. Just so that I'm being clear, I'm marking what is the center front of the trouser onto the cloth next to the zip. The mark I'm making shows the center front. Also, making sure the fly side on top is folded properly so that it's folded on the center front as well. These two sides need to be placed on top of one another. This needs to be pin closed, so I put a ruler behind it, but a sleeve board would have been better. Pin it closed, only a max of about 4 pins should be used unless the rise is really long, plus pin the waistband so that it is properly closed as well. Turn the trouser over so that you can see inside of the trouser and see the bearer. The pins help, but make sure the fly is still laying flat. Fold the bearer out of the way of the zip and pressing the center fronts flat and the zip against the fly. Chalk along the edge of the zip tape and make at least one notch at the base of the zip to show where the zip needs to be sewn to. Basically, I take this to machine and sew a stitch to join it to the bearer. It could be basted down through the fly in the trouser, but this is potentially stronger and nearly as easy. I just want to show how I do it with sitting down without leaving the machine first. Back to the start with the center fronts marked on. I put it over my knee and place the center fronts on top of each other and pin them down. ideally without pinning it to the trousers I'm wearing. Again, turning it over, placing the right side of the trouser onto my knee, it can be flattened and the bearer moved out of the way. The previous mark is still visible and it's clear that it's not in the same place as before. This indicates that doing it on camera is not too reliable. Holding the zip tape down, chalking the edge and making a few notches this time. Holding the zip and the fly together, taking it to the machine. Normally it'd be a bit neater and more careful for making the actual fly, but I just want a very quick stitch that only holds it in the correct place. For the second time, practically just using the zip teeth as a guide. Towards the top, the zip head needs to be moved down and out of the way to stitch past it, so some of the pins have to be removed near the top to get it down below the presser foot. Also, as a side note, I don't ever change the foot of the machine, I just work with the width of what the foot is. Sometimes, though, I can move the horizontal position of the needle so that it's exactly 5mm from the edge of the foot. Otherwise, the whole way up, just holding the tape against the chalk. I don't backtack at the top or go much higher than the fly. Again, I want to remove the zip as easily as I can later, so it's not exactly as strong as a real one would be. There are some small potential machine stitches to replace hand stitches from here, but this is where I would usually finally leave the machine. The first baste that I want to do, or hand stitch, is along the center front of the fly side to keep the seam slightly inside of the trouser and to keep the center front on the fold of the cloth. This is just between the fork notch and the waistband. The next practically takes the place of the J-stitch. Or the next is the J-stitch. The fly needs to be flat against the trouser, and I slip stitch through the trouser to fasten the fly along its outer edge. You could slip stitch like I do, or use a lock stitch. A running stitch won't hold it firmly enough in my opinion, and any other stitch would just take an unnecessary amount of time. That's the fly, so the hook and bar should be added. It doesn't have to be, but if you don't add them, then you need to pin the top of the trousers closed when the person tries them on. To keep it clean, I start by basting the top of the zip down onto the waistband, not pulling it, just placing it there and doing a baste. I also then fold the excess band roll over and begin basting that towards the center front. Towards the front, I get the hooks we use in Bespoke trousers, which are the sort that have to be sewn down and then later covered by the lining, which has to be sewn down by hand. I place it onto the front less than 1 centimeter from the edge and halfway across the canvas. I just sew it through the varied holes it has for sewing through. I still use my cotton basting thread. I still want this to come off easily later, but it's more important that it is quite firmly attached, so that they don't pop off when they're being tried on. I almost never use doubled up thread, but here I let the thread double up rather than using a single strand, as should almost always be done. This just makes it faster and stronger for sewing on. Also, I don't have to be at all careful to make the stitches neat, or only through a single layer of the canvas because there's no cloth on the waistband anyway. Close the zip and lay the front flat again to find where the bar needs to be. I have red chalk because white chalk would be useless, and hold the hook against the right hand side's canvas to chalk the edge of the hook and either side. This tells me exactly where the hook needs to go. Practicing this and getting it right makes it easier to commit when making a finished trouser, because some methods involve making holes that don't necessarily damage the cloth but can leave it scarred. Hold the bar against the edge of the chalk on the bearer's side. Again, I'm doubling thread and just looping it around either side of the bar. These bars make it easy because they have holes and a flared base. I just stitch over either side a few times. I don't even bother to cut the thread between the top and the bottom. I also scarcely bother to tie it off because the friction of the stitches stacking on top of one another keep it in place. The last stitch is folding down the zip on the inside of the bearer. This only stops it flapping about, it's not necessary otherwise. Just don't sew over the zip teeth on the right side of the bearer. Close the zip and catch on to firstly check that it looks like it's been done correctly, and then check the width of the waistband, or circumference. I continue to be amazed whenever it comes perfectly to measure. This one was good to about the millimeter. Lastly, I want to press the seams. This is just to make them sit flat when they're being tried on so that the look of the style is accurate. Just flipping it inside out and press the seams to relieve any tension in the stitching in the cloth. Again, I don't bother pressing the seams open. It'd take longer and potentially be 5% better. I just think it's a waste of resource for this. Afterwards though, I do place the legs flat and press them flat there. This effectively presses the seams over, allowing them to sit as flat as they would do anyway, providing basically an equally accurate aesthetic of the trouser leg. From the knee down, I try to line up the in-leg and out-leg seams. This gives me an opportunity to press the crease in, the front crease, which just gives a better impression of what the finished trouser will look like, as well as affecting how they might want the trousers to fit. On both legs, I don't really bother pressing in the back crease above the knee. I just don't see the point at the moment. That was making a trouser toile, as I like to call it. The other advantage to cotton is that it is very easy to see the imperfections in the pattern as it hangs over the body, because it will never drape well like a wool cloth, and by extension a normal trouser based. The toile can then be used to the best of your ability to test the fit of the trouser patterns, which I intend to become better at and create guides for.